Hello everyone, I'd like to welcome you to the first screencast for Anth 101. We'll be finishing up our discussion of evolution today. On Wednesday, we talked about microevolution and how it alters allele frequencies between populations, and today we'll talk about macroevolution and how it explains the development of new species and the extinction of old. So again, to review, microevolution is small evolution that occurs over short timescales for a given species within a few generations. So it leads to variation within a species, but between populations. Macroevolution, on the other hand, is big evolution. So it occurs over long periods of time, geological periods of time, and it results in new species, or the extinction of old. Species, again, are reproductive community populations that are reproductively isolated from others. So before we talk about macroevolution, I wanted to give you another example of microevolution and talk about sickle cell anemia. So sickle cell anemia is a genetic disease that leads to the production of these sickle cell red blood cells, or hemoglobin. So the normal hemoglobin allele is represented by HbA, and the sickle cell hemoglobin allele is represented by HbS. So when individuals are homozygous recessive with the HbS alleles, this results in sickle cell anemia. It tends to be a fatal disease, so it works against evolution. People are less reproductively fit. However, people that are heterozygous become carriers of this allele. So the surprising thing is that if it's homozygous recessive and lethal, why do we have this allele? Why do we have this HbS allele? And why are its frequencies so high, up to 20% in some populations? Well, this is due to genetic drift, and it's also due to natural selection. So we particularly find this allele to be prevalent in areas where malaria is endemic. And that's because when people are heterozygous and they have the HbS allele, this actually confers resistance to malaria. So this is an example of what we call balanced polymorphism. It's where the heterozygous genotype confers greater fitness than either homozygous genotypes. Just to review evolutionary processes, we have gene flow, which is a movement of genes among populations in groups due to a sudden expansion or migration. So a classic example of this is European colonization of the New World and the importations of Africans. So it started mixing genetic genotypes from Europe, the Americas, and also Africa. We also have genetic drift, which is a more random process. And one good example of genetic drift is what we call the founder effect, and this occurs when a small subgroup of a larger population becomes isolated, taking with it unrepresentative proportions of alleles from the larger population's gene pool. So this means that alleles become more prevalent than they would in the larger population because they were founded by this small population that's become reproductively isolated. So an excellent example of this comes from Pitcairn Island. Pitcairn Island was founded by mutineers from the HMS Bounty. So what they did is that when they mutinied from the ship with Captain Bligh, they sent the officers adrift in this launch, and they had to sail thousands of kilometers across the ocean. But the mutineers had to flee, and when they fled, they eventually wound up in Pitcairn Island. So I believe it was 10 males and 12 females of Tahitian descent. So in the British Navy at that point in time, the punishment for mutiny was death. So they had to go to an isolated area where they would never be found again. There was an island that had been discovered, but it had been misplaced on maps, called Pitcairn Island. So they eventually found the island, they settled there. So what would you do if what you did would mean death for you if you ever got caught? Well, as soon as they settled on the island, they burned their ship. So then they were isolated from the rest of the world until they were contacted again by whalers, and this led to certain consequences for their gene pool. The most important of which is that there was genetic drift. Some of these settlers eventually moved to Norfolk Island, which is the nearest island nearby, and they actually kept track of the population, the genealogy of the population through records, and they've been the subject of many different genetic studies to see the effect of what we know as the founder effect on genetic drift. So what you see here in this diagram, this is the pedigree of the islanders founded by the Pitcairn mutineers, and what happened as this population was isolated. So what you can see in this spaghetti mess is that all these descendants over time, 5,742, the vast majority of them can trace descent to the original 9 settlers on this island of European and Tahitian descent. And so what you find in this island is you find a high prevalence of certain alleles than you would in the larger European or Tahitian population. So this is a clear example of genetic drift due to the founder effect. So let's skip on to talk about macroevolution. So macroevolution is a process by which species are created over long geologic time periods. So now we're talking thousands or even millions of years. So let's contrast. We have 2 different types of macroevolution. So one model is what we call phyletic gradualism that you see here. So in this case, macroevolution is a uniform process. The eventual outcome of microevolution given enough time. So phyletic gradualism is long and gradual, and the mode of speciation is a result of what we call anagenesis, the gradual transformation of one species into another species. So in phyletic gradualism, the species boundaries are arbitrary. That's because populations are constantly evolving. And as a consequence, there's no sharp breaks in the fossil record between old and new. We can find all these intermediate species within the fossil record that explains this transition from one species to another. So punctuated equilibria and equilibrium, on the other hand, is different from microevolution. So it's not a uniform gradual process. It's a result of what we call cladogenesis, which is a rapid production of multiple new species alongside parent species. So instead of being gradual, it happens very rapidly over relatively short periods of time. In this case, speciation achieves the shifting of genetic and morphological centers of gravity, or parent and daughter species, such that each species is now free to accumulate more variation and hence more potential species differences. So this is a diagram from the book that compares phyletic gradualism and punctuated equilibrium. So when we think of phyletic gradualism, we think of there being one parent species that slowly, over time, evolves into 2 separate species. However, in terms of cladogenesis or punctuated equilibrium, instead what we have is we have one parent species that can eventually evolve into 2, 3, or even 4 different species all at the same time. So this is what we call cladogenesis. We see species A continuing to exist alongside similar related species B and species C that all share a common ancestor. So here's another diagram of phyletic gradualism. So this is time across this axis and evolution. And what you can see here is, again, a single species evolving over time to a second species and then eventually onto a third. So it's long and gradual. But punctuated equilibrium, on the other hand, means that there are brief periods where you see rapid development of different species. So in this case, when you look at the fossil record, you see that there are not intermediate forms. And this suggests that there have been times when the environment was in extreme disequilibrium. This could be due to climate change. This could also be due to isolation or dramatic events such as volcanoes, which leads to extinction or isolation. In that case, as different populations are found in different parts of the world or different areas, that they speciate much more quickly. So again, this is just to review anagenesis, slow gradual process of transformation from a single species over time in cladogenesis, the birth of a variety of descendant species from a single ancestral species that happens rapidly. Now note, when we're talking about rapidly, we're still talking about thousands of years or tens of thousands of years, but it's much more fast than phyletic gradualism. When we go on to talk about the fossil record in humans, we'll see other examples of this. In fact, there's been a lively debate among paleoanthropologists of whether or not the evolution of hominids or the evolution of humans is due to this kind of phyletic gradualism, or whether it's been actually the case of punctuated equilibrium. And we'll see that when we look at the fossil record, that you can make a case for either. So with that, what I'd like to do is end our discussion of microevolution and macroevolution, and tell you that next week we'll start talking about primates. So what I would like everyone to read chapter 4 on primates, and in reading the chapter, I'd like you to be prepared next week to talk about the evolutionary relationships between humans and primates. And I'd also like you to be prepared to talk about the behavioral similarities and also the differences between humans and primates.